And welcome everybody to week three. Um, and just as people arrive, we're going to do a little bit of a recap. But let's start with prayer. Let's pray. Wondrous God, we thank you for your presence with us tonight, for learning more about how the church developed, how we came to our the those early years that we are often unfamiliar with. Grant us a sense um, of that story, of that arc, and help us to deal with the themes and the issues that we have tonight. Be present with us always. Be with us in a spirit of questioning and asking and listening. Be with us tonight, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Well, welcome again, everybody. We now have uh, in terms of our overall themes, in terms of where we've been and where we're going. Of course, this week this is correct. Last week this outline was not correct. So we were looking at the overview, probably, and just the earliest part of the development of Christianity in was our first session. The second session, we did the development of Christianity in the Roman Empire during a period in which it was regarded as a mystery religion. And then today we're dealing, the overall theme is called evolution and migration, but realistically, what we're actually talking about is the development of the Western, of the church in the Western Roman Empire because of the political atmospheres and that. Next week, of course, is Remembrance Day, so we're not going to be working with that. We're not going to be here next week, but the week after that, so 2 weeks from tonight, we get to talk about the so-called Dark Ages. They're not the Dark Ages is not a really good term for it. And then we're going to be talking about the development of what became known as the Great Schism between the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox tradition, sort of collectively. So we'll get some bits, some insights into that in terms of how the early church developed, particularly in tonight's development. And but I wanted to do a bit of a recap. So last week, if there was a theme for last week, the question was, what do we believe? And that came out of the development in terms of the various challenges. Threats aren't exactly the right word, but that's the word that I used last week. But the challenges the early church went through, both external, namely the Roman Empire itself, and the apathy, ambivalence, or even hostility that it showed to early Christians, but also more specifically, as Christianity is developing alongside a number of different mystery religions. The we also had that challenge. So in that sense, the greater threat or the greater challenge was internal, because of you had these contemporary mystery religions, but also different other movements that began to erode at the core of Christianity, which kind of forced early Christians to ask the question, what do we believe? And so you had challenges like Gnosticism and the like, so with that question, these the external and the internal challenges threatened to pull Christianity away from being a monolith, a monotheistic faith, because Gnosticism by definition is polytheistic, and of course the Roman persecution was more along the lines of you're not loyal to the empire, and both of these had to do and that threat as to what we believe. Is it appropriate for Christians to offer a ritual sacrifice in front of the statue of to the emperor? The answer is no. But if you answered no, that could get you in some real trouble. So keep in mind, during this period, the creeds as we know them today and these statements of faith didn't exist. They evolved out of this because of the different crises they faced. But just okay. The I'm about to my coughing companion is about to go up to his friend's place. Ian. So off you go.
Rings the doorbell upstairs, Jen.
Okay. Anyway. So anyway, one of the things that I talked about last time is the development of the Nicene Creed around approximately 325 at the request of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And, I sort of skipped ahead. Well, how did we get to the point of it being an illegal movement to suddenly the Roman emperor at the time gathering them together? So, but the overall question, if we're dealing with one today, is the question of what do we do with power? And it is still something that we are wrestling with now. You just think of tomorrow's election in the United States, and the resurgence of Christian nationalism, and what do we do with power? Because it is not the history hasn't been kind to us, and so that's part of what our discussion tonight is. So, anyway, going back to this sort of ending question that we had at the end of it was, how did we get just pardon me for a moment. So how do we get from Christianity being a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire to having the Roman emperor call a meeting of bishops to resolve a doctrinal issue? I mean, it just doesn't seem to be that, especially when we talk about the Diocletian persecution happening almost immediately before all this happened. And it's the reality is things do change, and sometimes there can be slow, gradual evolution, and then there can be revolutionary moments. And so that's part of what we're talking about this. As I mentioned last week, there was persecution. It did happen in the Roman Empire, but it was not a consistent thing, and it wasn't specifically directed at Christians, but Christians happened to get caught up in it because the question of loyalty to the empire, and that was expressed through often attributing divine authority to the Roman Empire. But at the same time, there seem to be these ebbs and flows of this. Like, for example, in 260, there was an Edict of Toleration under Gallienus, which allowed Christians to live in peace, and at the time, even build some small places of worship and to keep cemeteries where they were allowed to bury people. But at the same time, those rights that were granted through this were then taken away, because at this point, churches only ever met in people's homes. For example, and I believe I've actually got a map of this one coming up. The oldest worship space that archaeologists have found dates to approximately the middle of the early to mid third century. And it was a house church in what is now modern day Syria, which is on the border of Iraq. And you can see just sort of in here this kind of chamber inside somebody's house that was a dedicated worship space. Now you can't really see this, but trust the archaeologists on this, that this was unearthed, and it seemed to be that. But sometime after that, there was a phenomenon known as the Great Persecution. And this happened between about it was the latter part of the third century that we have this little piece without too much going on, that Christian communities are able to flourish and to actually grow. as an active part of Roman society. But then along comes Diocletian, and Diocletian is here, and what happens is that the Roman Empire undergoes some stress on its own, where the empire almost collapses from civil wars, infighting, and a lot of different people trying to claim the Roman throne, and then we have Diocletian coming along, is that he believed that the empire itself was too large to govern, but and reformed it so that you actually had it, broke it into 4 administrative districts, and then you had a co-emperor as well as 2 sub-emperors, each governing their own space. And so the emperors held the title of Augustus, and the sub-emperors were Caesar, with Diocletian basically ranked at the top. So this is what the Roman Empire looked like at pretty much the end of the 3rd century. And curiously enough, see where Diocletian actually had control. So you would think Rome itself would be the main capital, and it's not. Even though it's still called the Roman Empire, but Diocletian actually has control of the area, specifically of Asia Minor. He makes his capital in Nicomedia here. And so, curiously enough, where Diocletian is also the same territory, at least in part, in which there are larger numbers of Christians within the Roman Empire. Anywhere east of here, like yes, they are around the Aegean Sea, but certainly anywhere in they're just tiny minorities in the Italian peninsula and further on. So what Diocletian was trying to do was to reinforce that the establishment and the dominance of Rome. Let's make Rome great again, was Diocletian. And so that's where he comes on. And so he starts rebuilding temples, focusing on the Roman pantheon, and what's referred to as the imperial cult. In other words, the imperial way of worshiping, that regarding that the emperors themselves being a divine office, and then you have these temples to Jerusalem, to Hercules, to Mercury, to Apollo. Notice a lot of these are all very patriarchal, male-centered, that you don't have as many as, say, for example, Athena or Venus, depending upon or Hera. The closest you get is Hercules, which is actually Heracles, sort of named after, but still a male figure. And so while it didn't insist on exclusive worship, basically, at this point in time, remember how I said during the time of Revelation, at the end of the 1st century, you had approximately 6,000 Christians in the entire Roman Empire. But by the end of the 3rd century, so 200 years later, we now have 6 million Christians by estimate in the Roman Empire, most of them located in the eastern portions. And so that's now, at this point, it's gone from barely a footnote in any sort of census, like not enough to fill that other box, to about 10% of the empire's population. That and represents, that's about 1,000% in growth over 200 years. Now, although really the year-over-year growth period was about 3.5%, versus the general population only growing at a rate of about 0.6%. Now, granted, these are historical estimates of historians doing that kind of thing. We tend to overestimate the size of cities and populations. The populations then were much lower. Like, for example, Jerusalem was considered to be a large city. its population probably at the beginning of the first century at best was 20,000 people. So it would be, like 1/5 the size of Nanaimo. That's how big, and Jerusalem was still considered to be a large city at that point in time. So we have to make sure that we're not overestimating how large these centers were. But at this point in time, Christianity represents approximately 1/10 of the entire Roman Empire's population in terms of that. And so those first edicts of persecution didn't really come into effect until about 20 years after Diocletian started. He was at that point, he was purging the army of both Manichaeans, and Manichaeanism was a mystery religion within the Roman Empire as well, that had origins. It was much more Gnostic in its outlook, and it had a lot of it was also had a lot of Persian influence, although not necessarily Zoroastrian, but it sort of emerged. It sort of some of its thought came from points what would now be Eastern Syria and into modern day Iraq, as well as Christians. And so, Diocletian is busy purging anybody in there who has this outlook, making sure that they are loyal to the Roman pantheon, to the emperor. That test of loyalty was required. So initially, the first thing he goes after isn't the Christians. He goes after the Manichaeans first, and then he goes after the Christians. But that was largely, it was Galerius who launched that. And so the Great Persecution lasted, as you can see here, it wasn't a long period of time. In the grand scheme of things, you're having it approximately over a period of about 8 years, and unevenly applied throughout the empire. And then but each of the various emperors in the 4 quadrants of the empire applied it unevenly. It was most enthusiastic under Galerius, and then Diocletian himself. So really focused in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. And then the actual edict of persecution, this is basically what would happen: the destruction of any physical buildings, burning of holy any sort of scripture, the confiscation of the church property after the building was built, so they couldn't rebuild on it. Christians could not take any collective legal action for remedy for this happening, and a loss of privileges for people in high rank who refused to recant from their faith, as well as the rest of local state officials. Then there were beyond that three more edicts after that. Now, in this effort, ultimately, we know that this was the Great Persecution from the earliest years of the 4th century, but it failed. And part of it is because one of the emperors in the western part was Constantius, and he only enforced it the first part of it in the region. And then he was elevated from Caesar to Augustus in the western provinces, and then suddenly died. And of course, unfortunately, because of the way the political system worked, being an imperial thing, that you had these, there was always this vying for power afterwards when a ruler died. There wasn't a clear and peaceful way of transferring power. And so his son, Constantine, he had largely trained. He was educated in the East. He was fluent in Greek, but he was called to the West when his father was elevated from Caesar to Augustus, and then Constantine himself just simply stepped into his father's place. Now, there was a competition that there was significant conflict the over who would be that, and Severus was his competitor. But Constantine himself ended the persecution, at least in the western provinces, in approximately in 306. And then we had whereas Diocletian himself steps down in 305, Galerius becomes Augustus in the east. So you now have Constantine in the west and Augustus to the east. Now, notice this east-west thing. Even though the great schism between the East and Western Church wouldn't happen now for another 600 years, there was this constant developing of a split between East and West. And himself, Galerius, was pressured into an edict of toleration in 311. But Constantine himself issued the Edict of Milan, and it took the toleration to a step further. So beyond just toleration, Christianity became legalized within the Roman Empire in 313. So between the start of the Great Persecution and the Edict of Milan was only 10 years. This all happened very, 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 very fast. And so suddenly, Christianity went from this underground mystery religion to now a recognized, legal, legally practicable religious tradition within the Roman Empire. And then Constantine himself. And there's a whole story about how Constantine came to power that I'm not touching on here. That he himself had, as legend has it, that there was a battle that he was involved with, that he had a vision, and in the vision was a symbol called the Chi-Rho symbol, which to us looks like a P with an X overlaid on it. And that really it should be like an X and P. Those are Greek letters for that Chi being the X symbol and Rho being the P looking symbol. And you've actually seen this in many, and it is perceived as and understood as a Christian symbol because it is the first two letters of the name of Christ. And apparently, as legend has it, he had this vision of this symbol, had his soldiers put it on their shields, and they apparently won a battle with it. But at the same time, Constantine himself never converted to Christianity during this period. As we understand it, is that he did receive baptism pretty much on his deathbed, but at this point in time, he's not necessarily, but he's starting to show at least some interest in the development of Christianity. But he also noticed that there were differences amongst what various Christians from different areas professed and understood. Of course, one of the things that I hadn't mentioned, or I mentioned loosely a couple sessions ago, and is that Christianity didn't have a monolithic centralized structure. What you had was 5 different schools of thought. And the 5 different schools of thought were centered in Jerusalem, and I did mention this before, Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem. I don't know if I've got a map coming up. I may, if I do, I'll show this to you. Alexandria in Egypt, and certainly after Constantine himself would center it in Byzantium, and then what would be known as Constantinople would be another center, and then of course Rome in the Italian peninsula. So those 5 centers were largely where the Christian thought developed, and they would have various discussions back and forth. But Constantine called this council together to say, you know what, we've heard so many different places, so many different traditions in so many different places. Let's bring everybody together, see if they can agree on something. And what emerged out of that was the ultimately what would become known as the Nicene Creed, which, if you sort of compare the creeds that you may be familiar with, this is the long one, but the long one we have a clear tradition as to a clear understanding as to when the wording of that emerged. At the same time, there was because the question, there was also the question of, is Jesus God? And you had Arianism, for example, who placed Jesus certainly as divine, but not at the same level of God. So there was kind of a ranking system. Whereas in Trinitarian understanding that God as creator or father, Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit are all effectively equal understandings of God, just God in three persons. I mean, the nuances on that are much more in depth, and I'm not here to explain the Trinity. Just but in these aspects or understandings of that, and trouble is, every word that I use, someone might say, well, that particularly represents that particular heresy, and what I'm trying to say is this. What emerged out of this was primarily establishing that the three persons of the Trinity, for lack of a better term, were equally understood to be all of equal power and authority within understanding God, and yet it's still monotheistic, not tritheistic, as I know. Whereas Arianism sort of bordered on that because it was starting to place a ranking system, and so in the Council of Nicaea, those Christians who expressed Arian thought were effectively shut out of Nicaea, but Arianism as an understanding sort of lingered until about the 7th century. Again, there was never a point at which someone was burned for their, even if they were excommunicated, they were not executed for their beliefs. That would come later. So we have, but what also began to happen is that as Christianity became legal, they also became more involved with the political life of the empire, and so with that legalization, over about the next 70 years, you had this kind of growth, and with this understanding in terms of how we understand God, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius I on February 27th, 380. So about approximately 70 years later. And so we had it going from a legal religion to the several generations later, now becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, transitioning from a time of a polytheistic pantheon to Christianity itself. And so then a question began to arise out of this: is what do we do with this power? All of a sudden, we are like the emperor has now made us the official religion. What do we do with that? And so I'm gonna let's just kind of pause there for a second, because the other thing to talk about is that in Christianity itself, particularly in the early church, the role of women was actually much more diverse and much more influential than it eventually became. And so up until the Edict of Milan, and of course the making making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, we do know that women played a very significant role in the development of the early church. For example, going all the way back to Paul, despite what that little verse in 1 Corinthians says, that is thought to be a margin note that was added at a later point in time, that Paul specifically refers to several people in his letters, including Phoebe in Romans, as well as Junia, also as either diakonia, or referring to them as apostles or teachers. They specific and the thing is, the word for men and women was exactly the same. There was no difference. These people held the same roles in the development of the early church. So of course, Junia as apostle, Priscilla worked directly with Paul, and far more egalitarian. That the role of women was much more prevalent in the development of the early church. But the thing is, the society into which Christianity is expanding, Greco-Roman society, was very patriarchal. And unfortunately, as that developed, that expectation of, like, for example, even within the Bible itself, that you have certain examples of the post Paul writings, or the writings even attributed to Paul, that are thought to be the technical term is called Deuteropauline, but stuff that is attributed to Paul that Paul didn't actually write because it came later, had these household codes that represented that Greco-Roman society. In other words, wives obey your husbands, slaves obey your masters, that kind of thing. That was Greek society being reimposed back onto the development of early Christianity. So and unfortunately, we have this softening of Paul's much more radical stance being put into it. So women did play a role, but unfortunately, as Christianity became more and more ensconced in power, it reflected more and more the Greco-Roman society, that patriarchal, and eventually that particularly roles in church leadership fell almost exclusively to men. Not completely, but in certain terms, as there was like a glass ceiling was installed. So again, how do we deal with power? And up until this point, much of its early life, Christians lived as a hidden minority. And then, dealing with persecution. And the thing is, there was a respect for the Roman authority prior to Nero's first persecution. Paul himself actually respected Roman authority. Of course, he wrote this before he himself was executed by the Romans. And obviously, when one is executed, one does not get to say, I was wrong, because he never got that opportunity, because you can't do that without a head. But by the end of the first century, and this is certainly reflected in Revelation and other works, that Roman authority, Roman power was perceived to be not just suspect, but in some places just straight up evil. The Revelation especially has that, although it's that caution about the power of the imperial state and the dangers of mixing politics and religion, by the way. So Christian society developed not expecting to be in power. They operated on the margins of society. They actually grew at a rate faster than the population because they operated this way. And the thing is, even though persecution was always in the background, it was a concern, but they still had a remarkable amount of freedom or were able, maybe not necessarily freedom, but they were able to operate in this system. They got used to dodging the power in terms of their ministry of helping people, of being being a positive influence in society, but largely in the background. They operated very much in the shadows. But now, by the third century, and then of course into the fourth century, you have this. They are now able to more actively participate in Roman society. They could take on positions of authority, such as regional civil authorities. They could be part of this. And yes, the Great Persecution tried to shut them out of that, but was ultimately unsuccessful. And they could also be open about that and hold public offices. And there were those who said, you know what, being involved in politics is dangerous. And there were those that sought to distance themselves from that development of that power. There were some that really embraced it to say, hey, if this can further our mission of Christ reconciling power in the world, so much the better. And there were others that said, no, 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 no. We can't do this because it will corrupt us. And so a good number of individuals, particularly in the Eastern and Southeastern Roman Empire, themselves chose to isolate themselves as to traveling into the deserts in Egypt and Syria. They led a solitary, the phrase is ascetic life of prayer and contemplation away. They removed themselves from society. But because they removed, oddly enough, because they removed themselves from society in that sense, they were seen as great examples of the faith. So people would travel to them to learn from them, to teach them. And if you ever wonder where the various monastic orders and that, both in terms of the monasteries and the convent traditions developed, this is where it came from, is that removal of oneself from the world. And so these individuals collectively are known as the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. These would be the first monks and nuns within Christianity before the development of certain, like the various orders such as the Franciscan order or the Benedictine order or things like this. But this is where the earliest reflections of that, but these Desert Fathers and Mothers also they spent time in reflection, but they were also themselves largely, they were literate, so they would write about their experiences as well. So so what happens is that first response to being in power, that there was these monastic traditions grow and flourish, but the thing is, at the same time, so you have the ones removing themselves from society, but then you also have ones who are the embracing that new role in society and becoming more invested in political power. And so with that freedom of worship, there arose the creation of dedicated worship spaces, and they began to be built in places across the empire. And of course, actually, before I get to that third point, the other thing is when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it suddenly had the financial resources of the empire behind it to start building, like even though early Christians were free to build their own places, they were largely left to themselves. Once they were in power, they had then the resources of the state in order to build these massive edifices eventually. And over time, that became the norm, that the churches that were built were actually effectively government built by the governing authorities rather than individual churches and congregations. And so that's one of the reasons. Why don't they build things that big anymore? It's, well, you have the state apparatus behind you doing it. You can't. Now, there's another piece, though, is that unfortunately, because of those experiences in persecution, those who found themselves in power also unfortunately remembered out of those experiences of persecution, the Christians saw that the state religions of the previous of what it was before, anything of they saw that as a threat, and they even came up with a pejorative name for it, and that the name is pagan, or of the earth, so to speak. So and they became labeled as such. And basically, unfortunately, once Christianity came into power itself, ironically, they basically returned the favor, I guess, and began to persecute these pagan or polytheistic religions, and there wasn't a degree of tolerance there. And so anyway, let's move on at this point. By the way, any questions? Because we're moving through this. I just want to see where we're at with my with the slides, because I am moving through these pretty fast. So I want to kind of slow this down a little bit. Now, one of the things in this development, so, you said the two groups, you had people embracing the power and those who were rejecting it. First off, you still had the 5 different centers of Christian thought. As I said before, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, the Constantinople, and Rome. And the Constantinople and Rome would be the 2 major centers, particularly after the rise of Islam, because the other 3 would eventually be subsumed into that. But that's 2 weeks from now. But the other thing that Theodosius I did was he also administratively, instead of doing like 4 districts under Diocletian, he basically divided the Roman Empire into an east and west one last time. And this one last time would have an enormous impact on the surviving on the empire itself. Some of you may or may not know that the Roman Empire fell not once but twice, and the first time was roughly at the beginning of the during the 5th century, and the second time was in the 15th century. And that has a lot to do with the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire. So any questions? I see.
You're talking about the split of the empire.
Yes.
Then the Western Empire fell to Theodoric the Great in the middle of the 5th century.
Yeah. And
much later on, the Eastern Empire fell.
Yeah. The Eastern Empire fell to the Ottoman Empire, what would become known as the Ottoman Empire, which would persist right up into it would persist right up into the 20th century. So now the other thing is, I realized I split my 2 slides as about the role of women in the church. The other thing is, sorry, this slide should have been earlier. And so we know in the early church, many of these women were martyred. And one of the common things when individuals were martyred, many of them were elevated to what became sainthood. And of course, we also know, and I mentioned this before, we had the Desert Fathers, but also men and women who were in the Desert Mothers. So that even in the case of, in this patriarchal Roman Empire, as Christians became enculturated in that Greco-Roman patriarchal society, there were still women who themselves continued to be leaders in the church, who themselves also became solitary and monastic, and they were the Desert Mothers. There was also an early heresy that it had the unfortunate effect, like there were 2 women who were prominent leaders, but the heresy wasn't because they were women, but because they had a new message that claimed authority over Scripture, and that was the main thing as to why that group was the Donatists were regarded as heresy. It's like we have a new understanding, and basically we're introducing that they had their words superseded any of the previous witness before it. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before, and this, as I said, this slide should have been before, that as late, in the late 2nd century, you started to see the restricting of leadership roles exclusively to men. Anyway, so with that, so here's all that background. Christianity assumes, basically becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and begins to, it has this dichotomy between those who didn't like that and removed themselves from it, and those who embraced it and continued with it. But at the same time, during this period, there's also population starting to move in and around Europe for a whole kind of different reasons. And the late Western Roman Empire, there's also the German tribes that lived north of the empire, for various reasons, started to move and migrate. And someone's thought is that there was actually another there were other pressures from further east that were pushing these Germanic tribes to start moving into and through Western empires. But collectively, they were known as the Goths. So they weren't known as, the Germans, or like the term German would come later. But collectively, they were known as Goths. It's where you get the term Gothic. And they lived in areas north, north of the Baltic, and they tended, like the Greek and Roman cultures tended to refer to these people as Scythians or barbarians, and the name barbarian comes from the way that they perceive them to talk. But unfortunately, these population shifts, these movements, brought them into conflict in that there was this northern front on the Roman Empire in both the east and the west. And as I mentioned before, the Huns, particularly from further out east, were moving. They themselves were moving and raiding into the northeastern Europe, and they were the people were fleeing from this and moving into Western Europe. So the Huns basically pushed the Goths into the Western Roman Empire, and therefore into conflict there. And those migrations had a significant impact. And of course, we have in 410, Alaric I, leader of the Visigoths, sacks Rome, and that marked the beginning of the end of the Western Empire. Some of this is oversimplified, David. I mean, but initially, the irony is that Alaric was part of a tribe, and they were seeking refuge from the Huns in the Roman Empire. I mean, he served in the armies of Theodosius I, the person who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But when he was denied that promotion, of course, he had a great influence amongst the Visigoths, and they began to fight there. And so these are people who moved into the area over this time. They settled into Roman ruled territories, and yet they wanted to be able to govern themselves. But what eventually happened is, of course, the siege on Rome. Alaric represented the collapse of Roman rule in the West, but not in the East. And it is a little bit more complicated than that. because of course it wouldn't be until the late 5th century where like the Roman rule, the Latin speaking Western Empire would eventually collapse and never recover. And the thing is, the other thing to remember is that for the most part, the Visigoths themselves had adopted the official religion of the empire into which they were seeking refuge. But they tended to represent the more Arian variants of Christianity that had a certain the hierarchy within the understanding that there, but it was also blended with tribal rituals and practice. But the thing is, there was a respect amongst the Visigoths for the churches. And so when they were invading, they were attacking the political structures and that infrastructure, but they left the churches intact, which would in itself start to have an influence on its own. And so basically, Christianity itself spread through personal contact, small scale, what was called voluntary conversion that outstripped the overall population growth. They also, because the Visigoths themselves had offered a respect for, they largely left the churches alone. So they weren't destroying that infrastructure where they were destroying the rest of the political infrastructure as they came in. And so, you have this form of the Western Empire developing out of this. And this influenced the development of what we now call the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that said, like in terms of the theological orthodoxy, I guess, in terms of that, it was the Roman Catholic Nicene Christianity that eventually, in terms of its overall theological stance, that the others would adopt into. There were still elements of those local traditions coming in, for that we would eventually get. Like, for example, some of the traditions that we have around Christmas, for example, or All Saints Day, those kinds of things. It's not as simple as people would make it to guess. There's great complexity here. But you have this melting pot effectively of these cultures in Western Europe. So the process itself was gradual, not in it was just over slowly and over a period of time. But what eventually happened is that, of course, when the political structure of the Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire fell. I'm emphasizing Latin speaking because this does have a direct impact on the Western Church. And unfortunately, what happened is that whole decentralization, you had what sort of occupied that space of the development of what occupied that space politically was no longer the centralized Roman system of governance, but rather local warlords who themselves managed to establish their own little their territories where they could exert control. And out of that, you have this decentralization happening, and then we have this evolution into what would then become known as feudalism, where you had basically warlords themselves who had military power, establishing these fortresses and strongholds and offering to protect the citizenry around them in exchange for their working the land. And that's where the concept of feudalism, where you had a lord on a particular piece of land that offered protection to a certain range of territories, and as a result, that's how feudalism began to develop, and this would continue on. This shift from the Roman administrative state into a feudal society is what would happen during this point. But of course, the other thing is while all this is happening, the churches were left intact. So they retained their administrative structure, which was largely based on Roman governmental authority. They just had different names for it. And so they were able to retain a lot of that infrastructure. And because they also had that communication link, and because Latin, at least in the Western Church, became the so-called lingua franca, the common, it was used every day, but Latin was the way, a language that everybody could understand, and the Western Church in Latin, that's how they communicated. And so the Roman Church maintained their social structure that allowed them to survive, but also because everything was so decentralized, like you had individual warlords all over the place, the ones that actually managed to retain at least a sense of communication and a network, and therefore a certain degree of political power with this, was the Roman Catholic Church, and they began to occupy increasingly more political authority, where the Eastern Church never would, because there was in the Eastern Church the Eastern Christian Church was still the official religion of the Roman Empire in the East, but it was always under basically at the whim or at the under the authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor, or what would become known as the Byzantine Emperor, as opposed to in the West. There wasn't one political authority that offered that. And so eventually the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, began to exercise more and more of that authority of actually becoming effectively an indirect emperor of its own. That's not quite the right term, because but at the same time, that influence, all of a sudden you have the Western Church stepping into a power vacuum that was left by the Gothic invasions. So that actually brings tonight officially to a close right at 8 o'clock. This went a little quicker than I expected. So we're going to be talking about. I'm happy to hop back anytime, but just to give you an idea, when we meet again in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, that period between 500 and 800. This will also cover the rise of Islam, but also that question of what was responding to power in the East as well. So that's how we're going to be working with that. Now, my time frame here is until 8:30. So any questions you have, it's open season on John, please.
Okay, I found it very diplomatic that you used the Pope as bishop. When I was younger, I remember it being God's representative here on earth.
Yes.
That connection of them both being the same,
yes,
is one of the reasons I have a problem with the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
because they still believe that they are God's representative, and they're far from it. Because as you explained just a little while ago, such a long time ago, when everybody turned against the actual Christians, and how just over time the Catholic Church then accumulated so much power, at which point I believe they left God behind, because it became much more about power and influence, and how we can control and have all this money come to us. and it be less about everybody else that's on the bottom,
Mm.
that the rule, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself.
Yeah.
They turned around and completely did to others what was done to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you would be correct. Like, I mean, one of the things in terms of that is that there began certain traditions and understanding that, you know, sort of keep in mind when I use the term mythology, mythology is not a bad word. Mythology are the foundational stories that we have of ourselves. Like, for example, in Canada, the building of the CPR is part of the mythology, one of the founding myths of Canada. Now, the thing is, but at the same time, you can actually go down to certain places in BC. Like there is a plaque and a dedication site at Craiglehatchee, partway between Salmon Arm and Revelstoke, where you can go down and see where the last spike was driven. You know, where that mythology was solidified. You know, because it's part of that story. But there is actually a physical, tangible thing there. So some of the mythologies that were developed, you know, historically, you know, how, depending on how historically accurate, is that of course Rome claimed Peter as, you know, having traveled to Rome, being the first pope, therefore a unique authority. Rome always saw the church in Rome always thought itself to you know, or projected itself as being the first among equals. Truthfully, I think, you know, if I were to give my observation, there probably may have actually been an inferiority complex going on there, because the Roman Church was the only church that spoke Latin. The rest of the Christian Church spoke Greek. And so, like, we're talking like those five centers of Christian thought. That you know, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople were all Greek-speaking cities, and all the and then you had, like, out in the West, you had the Latin-speaking church. So automatically you've got a linguistic divide there, and so that sort of sense of inferiority. You know, maybe I may be being too harsh. I try to be charitable whenever I'm doing history, even though ultimately this,
Trying to be a politician.
yeah, except for the fact that this ultimately leads to the Roman Catholic Church in the West being a totalitarian state.
Okay, thank you.
So it gets there, and we get there. In this study, that ultimately, yes, that is the destination. This power that the Western Church begins to accumulate, not by design. You know, they didn't start doing it. It was more by accident. They fell into it, but once they started to get it, then it became more about design. And certainly when we get to, for example, next week, when we talk about the crowning of Charlemagne in approximately around 800, there is a very significant event that happens in that when we talk about that in 2 weeks, where that level of control suddenly becomes not so much, it becomes by design, not by design, and by asserting, rather than what was sort of left to them when the political infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire was smashed. So,
okay, one thing at this point, while it's sort of still in my head,
yes,
with the way that we are breaking it down and manipulating it, moving around, would we not be classed as heretics?
As part of the Protestant tradition,
as part of the whole system, because I find having these conversations to be amazing, because if there was a Catholic priest on the other side of this table, I know I would not be having this conversation.
yes.
So in doing it and having the opportunity to question, at what point because of not believing exactly what they say we should,
Yeah.
are we heretics?
Well, I think,
At which point?
yeah, the litmus test for heresy within the, in terms of heresy, and I'm not talking the burn type, as to whether or not the litmus test within Christianity has everything to do with the Nicene Creed. That is, if there's one sort of thing that says this is the litmus test under which you can understand yourselves to be part of the Christian tradition, if you largely are in agreement with this creed, is the Nicene Creed. And the reason for that, curiously enough, like for example, belief as to whether or not Mary is a virgin or not actually has little to do with the Nicene Creed, even though it's in there, because the Virgin Mary is a title, not a state of one's genital usage. Would be the best way to state it. The fact is that Jesus was born a human being of a human mother. That's what the Nicene Creed was emphasizing, not whether or not Mary, like believing whether or not Mary was a virgin. That's another matter. The fact that he was born, so that like he was a real human being, tangible, touchable. Because one of the
this is where you go to the Da Vinci part, whereas he was human one day and divine the next.
Yeah.
I understand that whole dramatic aspect of it.
Yeah, and the point is that fully human, fully divine in terms of Jesus. And the thing is, the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox traditions, and the most of the Protestant traditions all would agree with that, and would definitely fall under that category. Now, there are certain traditions that sort of refer to themselves as Christian, like any tradition that refers to itself as Christian and yet rejects the concept of the Trinity outright without trying to wrestle with it, would effectively remove themselves from that sphere. Now, that said, in terms of the Western churches, becoming more and increasingly part of power, it gets further away from that. But then you have the event of, like, for example, like, we're not even covering the Reformation, but the Reformation represents an effort on the part of the Western Church to reform itself, and that ended up with two aspects of it, of chunks of it breaking away into, and that's kind of where we've ended up as far as our history is concerned. But also, in that act of breaking away, the Roman Catholic Church began to reform itself. And there's been kind of those, even within the Roman Catholic Church, that kind of ebb and flow back and forth. So you have efforts to be more ecumenical of, like, for example, the Second Vatican Council is a good example of that kind of effort of trying to reclaim that. And then yet there are other elements of it that it still seems to want to revert back to that almost totalitarian state. So there's still that cycle going on in that. I don't know if that answers addresses your question, Richard.
That's okay, John. I could hunt you down.
You absolutely can. So that's if I'm in the office and you have questions like that, you are absolutely welcome to hunt me down and pin me down about some of those questions.
Because I was also curious, about at what specific point did they start to decide that women were not to be a part of the...
Well, really what you started to see, unfortunately, that shift happened fairly early on. It happened it certainly was starting to happen before, like towards the end of the second century. By the end of the second century, you started to have the patriarchal elements. Keep in mind, Greco-Roman society was very patriarchal. It was very male dominated. Only men could hold offices, and that kind of thing. And for many, like Paul, they found Paul too radical, because he was he had he worked with women. He encouraged their leadership, even to the point where there were people who were copying Paul's writings and writing a margin note saying that women should stay silent in church. I mean, so we actually have even some of that being sort of like hinted at somewhere in the late first century. But the involvement of women was largely kind of put and largely by, certainly by the time that Christianity became legal, if not, and certainly by the time it was the official religion of the Roman Empire, a lot of that element of women in leadership had unfortunately largely been suppressed.
Okay, I'll shut up.
Yeah. So, Beryl, I see a shift on your square just lit up. You're probably shifting in your seat, or do you have a question?
No, I was just laughing at Richard.
Yeah. So, but I mean, these
love
are,
you too, Beryl.
Yeah. I mean,
I love your design, your Remembrance Day.
Oh yes, if you haven't seen the Remembrance Day layout at Trinity, it is lovely. So with one of the things to remember in all of this is that when I'm trying to sort of explain developments, I'm trying to do it almost judgment free. Now that said, like we're still in a period here prior to the first person being put to death for what they believe. This hasn't even happened in any of the part of what we are talking about right now. The first instance of that actually happening, I believe, was somewhere in the middle of the 5th century. And it was the first example of where someone listened to somebody else, said, I don't like what they're preaching, and then basically complained to authorities. And because Christianity was an official religion at that point in time, all of a sudden you had the political authorities to being able to effectively enforce that. So, early Christianity, like Christianity didn't start killing people for their beliefs until they had political power. And that's a very important caution to remember. And so, when you have Christian nationalists, for example, wanting political power, I get very scared. Or scared isn't the right word, concerned. Because, with power comes, as the saying goes, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And because that power tends to corrupt, what we do start seeing in that development of early Christianity is a corruption of that power. In the Western Church, it becomes in the Eastern Church, while it had power, it was still subject to basically the you don't want to piss off the emperor, because that could have consequences. Whereas in the Western Church, there was no emperor to annoy. And so therefore that increasingly, and they began to gain more and more power. And as I was saying earlier with Richard, what eventually does happen within the Western Church is that it moves towards a totalitarian state. And in some respects, they do achieve that. A totalitarian state with a number of where there were a number of different various nation states of their own, but really it's they're effectively under the thumb of the Roman Church. and like I said, we will ultimately get there. You really see it writ large with the development of the early development of the Crusades. And if the times that I've actually taught a course on the Crusades, for example, I do recommend watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail and the inanity that happens there, because some of that inanity is actually historically accurate. I hate to say, but it is. And you can laugh at it now, but at the time there was no laughing matter.
You're a sick man, John.
Hey, I like Monty Python. So now, if officially, that is the full slides for tonight. I'm happy to stay in chat for at least for a few more minutes, or if there's any other questions. Unfortunately, I realized I didn't have a map from this one that I did have last time, that showed the various places in terms of those influence centers, those power centers in the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, I think I may be able to. Let me just see if I've got. I can probably pull up that slide. I'll have to do a quick shift and show the map a little bit more. I know what I have to do. I have to, sorry, I need to stop the share. I need to escape out of this, and then bring up this one and bring up the map. Okay. And then reshare this screen. So this is one from last week. Whereas just in terms of seeing this, you have these are the earliest church recordings, and this is a little bit more relevant for this. Of course, you see Rome here. Now, by this is prior to so this is intended as first century, but Constantinople is, whoops, don't click. Constantinople, now modern day Istanbul, is right in this area here, just on the Strait of Bosphorus, between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. And then you have Antioch, which is also a major center for Christian thought. And then Jerusalem here, although it's labeled here as Hierosolymiad, which is the name that Hadrian gave the name of to Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the middle of the 2nd century. And then, of course, Alexandria. So you had your Christian centers of thought here, here, and of course here. And you can see how removed from the Eastern Empire that Rome was. And so you have that sense of isolation. They spoke a different language, and also a certain degree of, you had this combination of them, in some respects being the redheaded stepchild, and at the same time finding themselves with a whole lot more power than any of the Eastern Church, any of the 4 Eastern centers have. And then, of course, with the rise of Islam, 3 of those centers would go away. So then you only had the centers in Rome and in Constantinople. As far as that sort of element is concerned. So, David, I've noticed you've unmuted.
Yeah. just wanted to say good night, everybody.
All right. So we can certainly wrap this up a little early. Remember, not next week because it's Remembrance Day.
Okay.
So I'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time. So on the 18th, same time and place. And welcome and thank you for coming. I'm just going to stop the recording now. And if you had any other questions for after the recording stop, please let me know. So again, thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording.
Yeah. Thank you, John.